1 year ago this Wednesday, I started the Formula One Iceberg series, and I think it's quite fitting that it ends in the same week that it started. Thank you so much for all the support, and here it is. Not only will you get to hear about some interesting stories in the world of Formula One, you'll also get to see my progression as a content creator in that time, from Subway Surfers in the first few videos to what it is nowadays. I'm going to continue to try and grow, and as always, thank you so much for the support. Let's get into the video.
Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to my F1 Iceberg series. Here I will take a deep dive into the history of Formula 1 and some of its biggest controversies in the history. It ranges from level 1, the tamest conspiracies, all the way down to level 7, the craziest. Canada 2019 was the 7th race in the 2019 Formula 1 calendar. Sebastian Vettel took pole ahead of championship leader Lewis Hamilton, and led with Hamilton chasing him up until lap 48 when Vettel went straight on at turn 4. 9 laps later, he received a penalty for re-entering the track unsafely, which meant he lost the race win. Vettel was understandably fuming with this and in protest swapped the number boards around, announcing himself the winner.
Okay, you win. I'm going to have to be very careful about how I say it though. Before Stefano Domenicali, there was Bernie Ecclestone. Before Bernie, there was Max Mosley. Mosley, born on the 13th of April 1940 to Diana and Oswald Mosley, who happened to invite the man himself to their wedding. He tried his hand at racing, making it all the way to Formula 2 in 1968, but then moved to run an F1 team March from 1970 to 1977. In this time, he led FOCA in the FISA FOCA war, something I will cover soon, which led to his becoming president of the FIA in 1993, a position he held until 2009. Now that the TikTok police are gone, I can finally get into the scandal. I mentioned earlier the family's links to a leader of a particular party that were frowned upon, and in 2011, a video surfaced of Mosley and 5 paid guests, paid up to £2,500 for their trouble, in garments of a particular summer camp for German Jews, demanding punishment from Mosley. Across the span of a 5-hour round, he and the women swapped positions on multiple occasions, but the undercurrent of certain events continued. Now, back to the racing, please. Tyrrell Racing was a team who ran in Formula 1 for 28 years from 1970 to 1998. In this time, they won the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship in 1971 as well as the 1973 Drivers' Championship, both with Jackie Stewart. Despite not winning another championship, they were notable throughout the 70s for innovation under a tight budget, including the only ever 6-wheeled F1 car which got a 1-2 at the 1976 Swedish Grand Prix. Turbo engines were introduced in 1977, but Ken Tyrrell did not have the proper funding to run with them, forcing them to use the naturally aspirated Cosworth DVF, a lighter but less powerful engine. At the time, the regulations specified a minimum weight, and the cars had to be weighed before and after the race. Tyrrell's way around this was to run the car underweight and then at the final pit stop fill the car's water tank, used for engine cooling, with lead shots to ensure it hit the weight limit. However, some of these would shoot out, enough for teams to get suspicious and report it to the FIA, who, whilst deeming the shots themselves legal, found other violations of the regulations, including illegal fuel in the water and holes in the floor of the car, and as a result of these, as well as Ken Tyrrell always trying to pull rule beds like this, disqualified Tyrrell for the championship.
Ferrari have more power than any other F1 team, and this is why. In 1979, the rulemaking body for the FIA, the CSI, was temporarily dissolved and replaced by FISA. FISA had many disagreements with the Formula 1 Constructors Association, aka FOCA, which represented the team's interests. This led to the FISA FOCA war and caused Goodyear to threaten to withdraw from Formula 1 altogether. As a result, the leader of FOCA, Bernie Ecclestone, agreed to have a meeting with all the team principals, the leader of FISA and her associates in 1981. After 13 hours of negotiation, all present signed the Concord Agreement. This was left largely confidential, but one of the terms of the agreement was that Enzo Ferrari and his team felt isolated at Maranello in comparison to all the British-based teams like McLaren and Williams, and that they should get special bargaining power due to their status the only full constructor on the grid. This led to Ferrari being offered a veto where they can essentially cancel any proposed regulation changes. They've held this power ever since through 8 different Concord Agreements, but haven't exercised it since 2015 in the proposed engine budget cap.
Is this the most controversial ending to a Formula 1 championship ever? In 1989, Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna were teammates and title rivals at McLaren. They had tussled all year, with Senna taking 6 wins to Prost's 4, but Prost's consistency meaning he didn't finish outside of the points all season. Going into the final 2 races, Ayrton had to win both in order to win the championship, so naturally, it would have come to a great relief to him when, in the penultimate round in Suzuka, he took pole by an incredible 1.7 seconds ahead of Prost. However, off the line, Senna lost out to both Prost and Gerhard Berger, although he was able to get back ahead of Berger in the first corner. In the first stint, Prost had managed to build up a 6-second gap to Senna and would have been delighted to see the Brazilian wasting time in the pits too, but Senna wasn't done. His final stint was incredible and he'd already caught up to Prost by lap 40. They stayed within a second of each other for 7 laps, with Prost's higher top speed and Senna's higher downforce setup making for an incredible battle. Lap 47, 6 laps from the end, is when it all happened.
The Suzuka circuit has 19 corners, and this happened in the space of 3. Senna used his higher downforce setup to get in the slipstream of Prost on the exit of Spoon, meaning Prost's straight line advantage was irrelevant as they carried on through 130R, where Senna cut the gap even more. The next corner is the chicane, and this is where Senna went for the move. Prost moved under braking to cover him, and that was it. The two cars collided. Both engines stalled. Prost got out, thinking the championship was done and dusted. Senna thought different. He motioned to the marshals to push his car and restarted the engine. After a pit stop to change the nose cone and an easy overtake on new leader Alessandro Nannini, he stormed off to the win, but was later disqualified for the push start, handing Prost the title win for definite this time. Or is this the most controversial championship ending in Formula One history? A year after the 1989 incident, Formula One returned to Suzuka in a very similar situation. This time, it was McLaren's Senna in the driving seat, while Prost, who had moved to Ferrari in the wake of the incident and declared that he would never drive alongside the Brazilian again, was 9 points behind. The point-scoring system at the time declared 9 points for a win, and due to Senna taking more victories over the course of the season, Prost would have to win at least one more race, but couldn't afford a retirement or a non-point-scoring position, 7th or lower. Senna again took pole ahead of Prost on the front row, but wasn't happy. He went to the stewards to complain as, at Suzuka, the outside line is the one you want to take into turn 1, but the pole position was on the inside, and unless he had a great start and was miles ahead into turn 1, it would be a danger to go down the inside. Alas, whilst the race stewards allowed it, FISA President Jean-Marie Balestre overruled the decision. At the start, as Senna feared, Prost got a better launch, but wanted to give up a position without a fight. Senna sent it. You've all seen the pictures, the aftermath. Prost claimed he retired as a result of the incident, but the facts are what matters. And the fact is that Ayrton Senna won the 1990 Formula One Championship. Abu Dhabi 2021 is a day etched into the minds of every Formula One fan, old or young, male or female, Murray Walker or David Croft. Even if you didn't watch Formula One at the time, you know about Abu Dhabi 2021. The 2021 season was one of the most dramatic in Formula One history, and the two title contenders, Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, entered the final race on equal points. As a result, the equation was simple. Score more points and you win the championship. If they finished outside the points, Verstappen would win on the basis that he had more wins over the course of the season. Verstappen took pole on softs ahead of Lewis in second on mediums. Hamilton got the better start and got ahead of Max, but Verstappen went for a lunge to get the lead back at turn 6. Hamilton ran wide and cut turn 7, claiming Verstappen cut him off. Stewards claimed that no investigation was necessary. Hamilton therefore held the lead and used his more durable tyres to extend the advantage over the course of the stint. On lap 13 of 58, Verstappen came in with Hamilton following a lap after. They both went on to hard compound tyres. On lap 53 of 58, Nicholas Latifi was fighting for position with Mick Schumacher but lost the rear of the car and hit the barrier at turn 9, bringing out the safety car. Verstappen, who had pitted under a previous virtual safety car and so was 11 seconds behind Hamilton, pitted again, this time for soft. Hamilton did not pit as he would have lost track position and Mercedes felt as though the safety car would stay out for the remainder of the race. After Verstappen's pit stop, there were 5-lap cars in between the two title rivals: Lando Norris, Fernando Alonso, Esteban Ocon, Charles Leclerc and Sebastian Vettel. As the debris was being cleared, the 5 were informed that they would not be permitted to overtake. However, 4 laps later, race director Michael Massey gave them the green light to unlap themselves, but no one else. Immediately after Vettel passed the safety car, race control announced that the safety car would be in that lap, leading to 1 lap of racing to decide the championship.
Verstappen, on softer, fresher, grippier tyres, overtook at turn 5 and held off Hamilton for first place and the title.
This race nearly killed Formula One in the United States, and here's why. In the early 2000s, Formula One had 2 tyre manufacturers. Bridgestone and Ferrari dominated the first few years of the so-called tyre war, but a new rule to ban tyre changes mid-race in 2005 benefited the opponent, Michelin, while Bridgestone were left behind. But they had one big flaw: they couldn't take higher tyre loads. And turn 13 at the US GP in 2005 was the highest tyre loads on the calendar. During the Friday practice, Ralf Schumacher suffered a tyre failure and slammed into the wall at turn 13. His replacement, Ricardo Zonta, suffered the same fate. That evening, a meeting was called for the FIA race director Charlie Whiting, Michelin representatives, as well as all team principals. It was proposed that a chicane be added to turn 13. This was rejected. Then it was proposed that pit stops would be allowed, but Michelin runners would have to pit every 10 laps as said representatives couldn't guarantee their safety. It was even suggested that Michelin runners take the proposed chicane, while Bridgestone runners could drive around the corner normally. This was rejected. Paul Stoddart, team principal of Minardi, one of the 3 teams running Bridgestones on the grid, said that he would not race if he couldn't guarantee the safety of the track, standing alongside his Michelin equals who had threatened the same. However, he retracted the statement after words with a Bridgestone representative and FIA president Max Mosley. At the start of the race, all cars lined up as per usual, but at the end of the lap, all of the 6 Bridgestone runners, Michael Schumacher, Rubens Barrichello, Tiago Monteiro, Narain Karthikeyan and Christian Albers and Patrick Friesacker
Were the only ones left as everybody
pulled into the pits, to the frustration of the fans. And approximately 100,000 of the 130,000 fans had left by lap 10, while the rest were left to shout abuse and throw beer cans and water bottles on the track.
The decision to race infuriated Michelin and they pulled out of F1 by the end of the 2006 season.
Bribery and bombs, all in the name of charity? Heading into the 1998 Belgian Grand Prix weekend, Michael Schumacher was 7 points behind Mika Hakkinen at the top of the standings with 4 races, including Belgium, left. These two, and David Coulthard 29 points behind, were the only drivers in mathematical contention for the championship. On the Friday, local newspaper Le Jour de Courrier, roughly translating to the Daily Mail, received an anonymous letter stating that Formula One boss Bernie Ecclestone had to donate 10 million Belgian franc, or $250,000, to a charity helping Sudanese children find medical care. It also states that the reasons for the threat are the American bombings on terrorists, who I would assume had some sort of link to these anonymous sources. It was also reported in the German media that there was another threat, this time to sabotage Michael Schumacher's car. Ferrari claimed they knew nothing of the threat, but placed extra security around the car just in case. Thankfully, nothing came of the threats, and Jordan came home to get a 1-2 in one of the most surprising weekends in Formula One history. February 2019. Donald Trump has just announced a meeting with Kim Jong-un. Emiliano Sala's body is found, and 21 Savage has just been arrested for illegal immigration. On February the 11th, Haas unveiled their new car, and it has a new look. A good look, with the name Rich Energy plastered all over the car. But what is Rich Energy? According to a CEO Williams story, they were an energy drinks company, although there was little evidence of this. The trustworthy brand tag was further scrutinised as the official Twitter was bizarrely unprofessional. One example was claiming to be hashtag better than Red Bull after 1 day of testing. But hey, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They promised all this investment, Haas have backed them up in this, so what's the issue? And then the White Bikes lawsuit happened. Here's a side-by-side comparison which shows pretty clearly the similarities between the two logos. Story was said to have been an unreliable witness, changing his story about the origins of the logo multiple conflicting times. As a result of this, Rich Energy's logos were removed from the car and paid White Bikes legal fees, although they still haven't received the money. The situation could not get any worse for Haas. A bad brand plastered all over the car, which was not at the races, metaphorically that season anyway. At least it could only get better from here, right? The week of the British Grand Prix started with a bang as Rich Energy's Twitter account claimed Rich Energy had terminated its Haas deal due to the on-track performances. Speaking to the Sun newspaper, Story compared the car to a milk float, and it wasn't long before this photo was circulated by the official Twitter. By this point, shareholders were getting desperate and were trying behind the scenes to wrestle back control from Story, which was described by the Twitter, almost certainly Story himself, as a palace coup. It appeared they won the battle as, the day after the British Grand Prix, Story announced that he had sold his majority stake in the company and they changed the name from Rich Energy to Lightning Bolt. In September 2019, Haas confirmed it prematurely cut all ties with Rich Energy. Haas have had a tumultuous time in Formula One since their debut in 2016, and nearly every season has had a huge drama for the team. 2022 saw Magnussen's controversial return. 2021 saw arguably the worst season for a full-time team ever, and they kicked both drivers out after 2020. 2019 saw Rich Energy, and 2018, a brush with the law. They went into the 2018 Italian Grand Prix 5th in the standings after a strong start to the season. However, teams were starting to get suspicious. Upgrades that had been brought to the car at the Canadian Grand Prix seemed to have significantly improved performance, for example at the Austrian Grand Prix where the team finished 4th and 5th. Close rivals Renault and team principal Cyril Abiteboul wanted to investigate further and found something. The regulations state that there has to be at least a 50mm gap between the bottom of the car and the ground. Haas's new upgrades made it significantly harder to see the gap to identify anything suspicious, and Renault's appeal to the FIA in Italy led to Romain Grosjean, who finished 6th, being disqualified. Formula One came back from the summer break in 2021 in incredibly tense circumstances. Lewis Hamilton led the championship by 8 points ahead of Max Verstappen after a controversial and crazy Hungarian Grand Prix that saw Esteban Ocon win, with Max down in 9th after an incident in Turn 1 involving Hamilton's teammate Valtteri Bottas. What F1 needed was a nice, non-controversial race. To Belgium they went. Qualifying was wet, very wet. So wet, in fact, that George Russell in the worst car on the grid was able to set the second fastest lap, while Lando Norris caused a red flag by aquaplaning at Raidillon, inadvertently helping his friend George to Williams' first front row start since the 2017 Italian Grand Prix. The race on Sunday was due to start at 3 p.m, but was delayed multiple times due to persistent rain, which helped out Sergio Perez as it gave his mechanics enough time to work on his car and fix it after he crashed on the way to the grid, meaning he could start the race. An attempt was made to start the race at 25 past 3, with 2 formation laps, but another red flag was waved soon after. At 6:17 local time, the race officially commenced from the pit lane, and 2 laps were completed under the safety car, meaning that the race could be classified and half points could be awarded, even though the race was stopped for good during the 3rd lap. With only 1 lap counting towards the race result, it became the shortest ever race in the history of Formula One by 28 miles. This is also the only World Championship Grand Prix where there is no officially recognised fastest lap. Just a year after throwing Haas under the bus, Renault were hit with a slap in the face of their own. The team were leading a battle for 5th in the constructors between themselves, Toro Rosso and Racing Point, and it was the team in pink that discovered the issue. Brake balance controls the usage of both the front and rear brakes to try and reduce locking up if the front brake balance is too much, or reduce losing the rear if the rear brake balance is too much. It changes between different corners, and the regulations state that drivers must drive the car alone and unaided. However, Renault found a way to help the drivers control the brake bias by changing it automatically. Racing Point spotted this and filed a complaint at the Japanese Grand Prix, meaning that their drivers Daniel Ricciardo and Nico Hülkenberg were stripped to their 6th and 10th places. Hypocrisy at its finest. Only a year after getting Renault disqualified, Racing Point were the ones under fire. Renault decided it was time for payback and reported them for having the same brake ducts as Mercedes. You see, Formula One teams were allowed to buy some parts from each other. At the time, Racing Point had engine, gearbox and suspension components from Mercedes. In 2019, they would have been allowed to buy brake ducts, but in 2020, the year in question, this was banned. Racing Point claimed they had not bought the blueprints, but instead had simply taken photos and tried to replicate as best they could. Whilst against the spirit of racing, it was technically legal. The compromise the FIA came to, as it wasn't clear whether they'd actually broken any rules, would be to dock 15 points and fine €400,000, penny change for owner Lawrence Stroll, but allowed them to keep the brake ducts, and the FIA tightened their ruling so it couldn't happen again. 2001 was a bad year for Prost GP. Changes in the ruling of cigarette advertising had left the team underfunded, and they had a revolving door of drivers with no less than 5 racing for them throughout the course of the season. But the team, and more specifically Jean Alesi, had done enough to gain 9th place and warrant £12 million of prize money provided they made the grid for 2002. Team principal Alain Prost decided he would rather see the team get liquidated than struggle on under new ownership. To earn back as much money as he could, he sold the assets and the naming rights, but crucially not the entry, to Tom Walkinshaw, Arrow's team principal, and his friend Charles Nickerson from Phoenix Finance. They hoped to make the grid for 2002 and gain the prize money earned by Prost the previous season. Initially they tried to enter, but the FIA told them that as they were a new team and the Prost GP racing licence from the French authorities had expired, they would be required to buy a new one, which they did. However, they were reminded of the new team $48 million entry fee and tried to claim their status as a new team, Dart GP, but racing under the previous Prost GP entry, which they hadn't bought because Prost hadn't sold, even going so far as to appear at the 2002 Malaysian Grand Prix with drivers Tarsen Marquez and Gaston Mazzacane. They were unsurprisingly barred by officials and we never saw them again. Team orders have always been a controversial strategy to employ in Formula One. This doesn't stop teams doing them, however, as was the case in the 2018 German Grand Prix. James Vowles was the head of strategy at Mercedes up until this year, 2023, when he took the role of team principal at Williams. Whenever a hard strategy call had to be employed, such as a team order, it would be up to him to convey the message to the driver. This began to happen around mid-2018 when Lewis Hamilton was locked in a battle with Sebastian Vettel for the title. In Germany, Bottas was apologetically instructed to let Lewis go and win the race. 5 rounds later, the same thing happened again. The difference between the two calls is that when Bottas was instructed to allow Hamilton to win in Germany, the battle between Vettel and Hamilton was so close. However, by Russia, the title was essentially over with the two teams' pace advantage over the field. 40 points in 6 races is a hard gap to bridge when your only realistic competitors are Vettel's teammate Kimi Raikkonen and the 2 Red Bulls of Max Verstappen and Daniel Ricciardo. Going into the 3rd round of the 1973 season, there were 2 clear contenders for the title already. Emerson Fittipaldi led the drivers in his Lotus with 2 wins out of 2 ahead of Jackie Stewart in his Tyrrell, who had finished on the podium in both. His case wasn't helped, however, when he qualified 16th in the South African Grand Prix, while Fittipaldi qualified 2nd, behind Denny Hulme and ahead of hometown hero Jody Scheckter. He wasn't the only South African on the grid, as there was a few one-off drivers looking to make a name for themselves. Jackie Pretorius in a Williams, Eddie Kizan in a Tyrrell, and Dave Charlton, who'd had an incredible effort in a Lotus to outqualify Stewart into 13th. His weekend got even better when he shot off the start and ended the first lap 7th, overtaking a multitude of cars including Mike Hailwood, Clay Regazzoni and Jackie X. And it was when he was looking to add Carlos Reutemann to this illustrious list when it all came crashing down. He lost control of his car, smashing into Mike Hailwood and the collateral collected Regazzoni's car, which burst into flames upon impact, knocking him unconscious. At the time, there was no clear ruling about red flags, so marshals waved yellows. There were 3 smashed cars on the track. Clay Regazzoni was burning in his BRM and they waved yellows. Yellows were still being waved even when Hailwood got out of his car to successfully drag Regazzoni out and clear. To be a top F1 team, you have to try and find ways to bend the rules. This is exactly what Mercedes managed to do in 2020 with their DAS system. You see, the car was so good that Mercedes were worried that it would be too easy on its tyres, so they could never get the heat into them and find their real peak operating window. So they came up with a dual-axis steering system, aka DAS, to change the angle of the toe. A low toe would improve cornering and heat up the tyres, but a high toe would give higher top speed on the straights. This was banned for the 2021 season, but the legacy of the system and the car itself, the W11, lives. The 2012 season started with a bang. 7 winners from the first 7 races. The 2 McLarens, the 2 Red Bulls, Fernando Alonso, Pastor Maldonado and Nico Rosberg all won before the first repeat winner, Alonso in Valencia. But wait, Pastor Maldonado, how did he win? The team finished 8th in the Constructors and the win was the 3rd of their entire points haul. What happened at the 2012 Spanish Grand Prix? To understand the story, you need to first get to know the players. Williams was created and owned by Sir Frank Williams, who was close friends with the Formula One boss Bernie Ecclestone. They had not run a race for 8 years, and one theory suggested that Bernie orchestrated the win as a 70th birthday gift for Frank. Pastor Maldonado was sponsored by PDVSA, who paid for his seat at Williams. PDVSA is a state-owned oil company, and there was an election campaign taking place at the time. This would have looked very good on Maldonado's close friend and Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez's bid for another term. But how did they pull it off? How would they have manufactured such a legitimate-looking win? The most popular theory at the time was that Pirelli was supplying some teams with steel tyres due to the fact that the FIA didn't want another Schumacher era, this time for Sebastian Vettel. Teams had complained that tyres felt different every race, so it could have just been Williams' turn for the Supreme tyres. After the race, there was a fire in the Williams pit box, which further raised suspicions of something not quite right, and a cleanse of evidence may have just occurred. Rear wings on Formula One cars were introduced in 1968 when the sport started to become less about the balls of the drivers and more about the design of the cars. At the time, they were tall, ugly, rigid structures, but nowadays, 5 decades later, they have developed into very sophisticated structures that can be changed minutely to have a dramatic effect on performance. For example, you want them as small and thin as possible in order to increase speed on the straights, but also as large as they can be in order to generate downforce to corner better. By tilting them back on the straights, it can reduce the area of the wing hit by the air and increase speed. However, due to the regulations, so-called Flexi wings are extremely hard to achieve, preferably impossible as far as the FIA can ensure. The last time this was in the headlines was in 2021, where early on in the season the Red Bull rear wing was spotted to be tilting back on the straights in Spain. Alfa Romeo and Ferrari also admitted to this infringement, and more rigorous testing of the wing was introduced afterwards. Another example of Mercedes bending the rules is in the 2018 Formula One season. As mentioned previously with their DAS system, they have historically struggled to get temperature into their tyres. In 2018, they had developed a system with holes in order for airflow around the car to get in and heat up the tyres. Previously, they had had smaller holes, but as of the Belgian Grand Prix onwards, they gradually made the holes bigger, and their decision to cover them up at the United States Grand Prix raised suspicions from Ferrari of potential foul play. Their claim was that it was no longer illegal temperature control, but instead due to the sheer size had become a movable aerodynamic device, which is illegal. On this particular occasion, Mercedes' cause were deemed legal, but a further investigation into such holes deemed Red Bull's design illegal. However, the next year, Ferrari showed that they were not as perfect with the regulations as they made out. Rumours were around throughout the season that Ferrari had managed to circumvent the fuel flow regulations. However, during the Mexican Grand Prix, the FIA checked the entire fuel system and had found nothing. From that point onwards, Ferrari lost significant performance despite team principal Mattia Binotto denying that it had anything to do with the engine. Adding to the suspicion, the FIA introduced a second sensor to monitor fuel flow as of the 2020 season. Rumours around the paddock suggested that Ferrari and the FIA had come to an agreement surrounding the engine, with Ferrari sharing their secret with the FIA to better monitor and plug power unit regulation loopholes. It is believed that Ferrari's technology was untraceable once the engine was switched off. Or is this the most controversial championship ending in Formula One history? Heading into the final race of the 1994 season, Benetton driver Michael Schumacher was 1 point ahead of Williams driver Damon Hill. They lined up second and third on the grid, while Hill's teammate Nigel Mansell qualified on pole. They both overtook Nigel at the start, and Hill trailed Schumacher all the way to lap 36 of 81. This was when Schumacher went off the track and hit the wall. Hill rounded this corner just behind Schumacher, but he went for the overtake in the next, and Schumacher cut him off, hitting Hill's suspension and retiring the Benetton. Hill tried to continue, but retired from the race with irreparable damage to the suspension. As neither driver scored, Schumacher took the title. Stewards declared it a racing incident, and Williams took no action to appeal it on the basis that they were still dealing with the death of Hill's teammate Ayrton. Is this the most bizarre qualifying session ever? Slipstream is important in Formula One. It increases speed on the straights as the car ahead essentially punches a hole in the air, and Monza is the fastest track of the season, the track where the cars will have the lowest downforce they possibly can, and the track where the slipstream is the most important. Q3 in 2019 saw incredibly close first runs. Charles Leclerc was on provisional pole with a 1:19.3, Lewis Hamilton was second with a 1:19.3. Valtteri Bottas was in third place with a 1:19.3, and Sebastian Vettel and the two Renaults the only other drivers to set a banker lap, with Kimi Raikkonen not doing a lap due to changing engine components. With the top being so tight, and the three cars without a time needing to pull a performance out of the bag off the bat, everybody was fighting for slipstream. It led to these scenes as nobody wanted to give anyone else the tow as the time ticked down, and eventually the only car on the grid to come across the line in time to set a lap was Carlos Sainz's McLaren. The Formula One circus went to Austria in 2002, with Michael Schumacher having won 4 of the first 5 races of the season, and he had almost double the points haul of second place Juan Pablo Montoya. Teammate Rubens Barrichello took pole ahead of Ralf Schumacher and Michael in third, a huge disappointment as he had started every race in 2002 so far in the front row. Barrichello led every lap until lap 62, where he pitted before Schumacher, but Michael pitted at the end of the lap anyway, handing the lead back to Barrichello. As soon as Michael exited the pits, Barrichello was instructed to let the German pass by team principal Jean Todt, and told that his contract to drive the most dominant car on the grid would be terminated if he failed to do so.
Barrichello replied, reminding him of a promise that the Frenchman had made about not making a driver relinquish a win. Tot simply replied it was in Ferrari's best interest. Barrichello stayed ahead all the way up until the final straight of the final lap, where he braked on the straight to let Schumacher through. Schumacher had hoped that no team orders would be needed and also slowed, but eventually he had to cross the line first, 0.182 seconds ahead of Barrichello. Ferrari were booed, jeered and whistled at as they approached the podium. Schumacher made Rubens stand on the top step and handed his winner's trophy to the Brazilian, which led to a $1 million fine for the team. Interestingly, they faced no sanctions for the orders themselves, but team orders were banned from 2003 onward. During the summer of 1997, photographer Darren Heath spotted Mika Häkkinen's McLaren with its brake discs glowing orange in the middle of a corner. Every Formula 1 fan worth their salt knows that the lack of an ABS system means that they can't brake mid-corner, or they risk locking up. He wanted to investigate further and discovered that there was indeed an extra braking system on the car, but only for one tyre, meaning that it increased cornering control and was worth around half a second a lap. Heath's discoveries were used by Ferrari, who first tried to develop a similar system but ended up appealing after the 1998 season opener in Australia, where McLaren drivers Häkkinen and David Coulthard lapped the entire field. It was banned in time for the next race, the Brazilian Grand Prix. Let me tell you the story of the F1 race with human guardrails. The 1970 season was crazy. It saw the first and only posthumous world champion as Jochen Rindt took the title after his death in one of the most tragic F1 seasons in its history. Rindt, Piers Courage and Martin Brain all died in Formula 1 cars throughout the course of the year. So you'd think, especially with Jackie Stewart spearheading efforts for better safety measures, that everybody would be more careful. Pedro Rodriguez had inspired so many to turn up to the Magdalena Mixuca Park in Mexico City, which has since been renamed the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez, if you recognise that name at all, for the Mexican Grand Prix for the previous 8 years, and this was no different. Except that it was. 200,000 people attempted to pack into the track on the Sunday, and all wanted the best view, meaning they drifted closer and closer to the track. Restrictions of the spectator areas were ignored as they smashed down fences and crowded the safety banks. Some even sat on the Armco barriers. Drivers like Stewart and Rodriguez tried to encourage the hordes back, but it was futile, and it was too much of a dangerous situation if they cancelled the race. A large-scale riot would have ensued. Miraculously, all the drivers stayed within the track limits, and there were no incidents other than Stewart hitting a stray dog. Unsurprisingly, the race was cancelled in all future seasons until 1986. Everything I am about to discuss is purely for entertainment purposes. Oh Jesus, am I really doing this? Jeffrey Epstein was one of, if not, the most notorious child predator the world has ever seen. He is certainly the most well-connected, as he listed royals and presidents in his list of contact and visitors to his private island, Little St. James, or Epstein Island as we would know it better today. The way he earned his money, which bought him the island and a rich lifestyle, is very vague, and certainly in his later years the only sources of income he had were a mystery. One theory is that he would fly the very rich and very famous, people who he called friends, to his island and do, or help people do, unmentionable things to young girls. He had already been convicted of such a thing, so said allegations were not out of the blue. Additionally, after his death in prison, his girlfriend Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted of trafficking young girls, for Epstein confirming his guilt. As I just mentioned, he had one of the most prestigious contact books in the entire world. When said book was discovered, first in a court case involving his butler in 2009, and the news website Gawker in 2015, and finally, an uncensored version crawled from the dark web shortly before his death in 2019. In it were many racing names. Formula E boss Alejandro Agag, Aston Martin team boss Lawrence Stroll, former bosses Bernie Ecclestone and Flavio Briatore, as well as ex-F1 drivers Pedro Diniz, Jacques Villeneuve and Eddie Irvine. I'm not saying being in this book had any criminal convictions associated with it, but being associated with Epstein is not a good look, and especially not being listed on the flight logs in his private plane, which was the only way to legally access the island where most of the alleged deeds occurred. None of the people listed were on the flight logs, but it's Irvine's account that raises concern. He never visited the island, but did attend parties hosted by Epstein, and even saw one of the women who accused Epstein and Maxwell of abuse. Irvine said he didn't see any girls he suspected of being underage, but that doesn't rule out the possibility. The Formula 1 app has been downloaded by millions and is an officially licensed news source for fans across the globe. In 2021, during the Austrian Grand Prix weekend, fans that had downloaded the app were surprised to receive 2 notifications that seemingly had nothing to do with the race. The first simply read "foo," while the second read I should check my security, smiley face. In a statement, Formula 1 confirmed that its systems had indeed been compromised, but reassured the users that the breach had not leaked any of their personal data. What happened when McLaren stole from Ferrari? In the late 1990s, Ferrari were in the midst of a dominant era, courtesy of Michael Schumacher on track and John Tort, Rory Byrne and Ross Brawn off it. This dream team led a group of engineers to title dominance, and one of those engineers is the main character for this story. Nigel Stepney was a chief mechanic at Ferrari during the Schumacher days, but in 2007 he had become upset with the departure of Ross Brawn, and as a result threatened to leave Ferrari, but instead moved to another role in the team in a non-trackside position. At the United States Grand Prix of that year, Ferrari launched an investigation into Stepney concerning irregularities at the Ferrari garage earlier that season, which would lead to his dismissal from the team altogether. On the same day, Ferrari announced that they had ordered a search warrant against a McLaren engineer who had been suspended by the team. He was later revealed as Mike Coughlin, and said search warrant found documents that were classified information from the Ferrari factory in Maranello. Documents had been reported by an employee of a photocopy shop near Coughlin's home in Woking, to whom his wife had gone with 780 pages of Ferrari documentation. The employee happened to be a big Ferrari fan, and after Mrs. Coughlin left the shop, he contacted the team's headquarters to notify them.
There was no evidence that they used the classified documents, and Coughlin was the only McLaren employee with a known copy. At the Hungarian Grand Prix, Fernando Alonso controversially held up teammate Lewis Hamilton in the pits for just enough time so that he couldn't set a final flyer. On the morning of the race, Alonso met with Ron Dennis and allegedly threatened to send email exchanges between Alonso, Stepney, and reserve driver Pedro de la Rosa to the FIA. Dennis laughed it off and even told FIA President Max Mosley that they were empty threats and that no information existed. On the 13th of September, McLaren were called to court and fined $100 million, as well as having all their points stripped, seemingly as an evidence of Ron Dennis sending further evidence. Well, that's what Ron Dennis said, at least. Mosley denied this and told the media that it was Alonso himself who'd sent the emails. On the 13th of December, COO Martin Whitmarsh sent a letter to the FIA, basically saying they had lied the whole time and multiple employees had access to the information. On the one hand, it confirmed McLaren's guilt and made them the brunt of the Spygate scandal, but on the other hand, all further sanctions were dropped. The 1998 season saw Michael Schumacher and Mika Hakkinen engaged in a tight battle for the title. Halfway through the season, Hakkinen was 2 points ahead of Schumacher heading into his team's home race. The belief that the Finn could win the race and extend his lead was enhanced by his qualifying, which ended up being nearly half a second faster than Schumacher behind, with Hakkinen's dominant lead in qualifying was extended to the race as difficult conditions saw a half-wet, half-dry track, and with increasingly treacherous weather conditions it caused chaos. Damon Hill, Johnny Herbert, David Coulthard, Jarno Trulli and Rubens Barrichello all span and retired in the first two-thirds of the race. Hakkinen had built up a lead of 49 seconds over Schumacher before he himself span, losing 10 seconds to Schumacher and eventually causing himself damage. Eventually, none of this mattered as the safety car was brought out thanks to the rain and more unpunished spins. The race restarted on lap 50 and it took only 2 laps for Hakkinen to make another mistake, putting Schumacher into the lead, and with a damaged car and bruised ego he nursed his car home in second. However, 2 laps from the end, Schumacher was issued with a 10-second penalty for passing Alexander Wurz under the safety car 15 laps earlier. Unsure whether this meant a 10-second penalty or a 10-second stop-go penalty, Ferrari brought him in on the last lap. In doing so, however, Schumacher crossed the line in the pit lane before reaching the garage and may have not actually served the penalty. A dispute arose around the circumstances of said served penalty, with his team arguing that they should have received the penalty within 25 minutes of the incident but actually received it 31 minutes after, 6 minutes late. The stewards then decided to punish him anyway, but by the letter of the law, a post-race penalty can only be used to punish a driver in the last 12 laps of the Grand Prix and so could not apply here. The stewards eventually rescinded the penalty altogether. The whole fiasco lost 3 stewards their jobs. The San Marino Grand Prix of 1994 was one of the most devastating Grand Prix weekends in Formula One history. Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna lost their lives in 2 different incidents across the weekend. It is Senna's incident that I'm going to talk about today. On the 7th lap, Senna was leading Michael Schumacher at a speed of 190 miles per hour going into Tamburello. For whatever reason, he didn't take the corner and instead struck the concrete barrier, losing his life instantly. An analysis of the onboard camera video saw a yellow button on the wheel move away from its normal trajectory and the steering wheel moving by itself, indicating a braking steering column, but the car did not have the reaction of one that oversteered. The technical director at Williams, Patrick Head, believed that Senna had made a driving error, a theory backed up by Schumacher and teammate Damon Hill, while the designer Adrian Newey believes that it was a tyre puncture from debris on the track following an earlier incident. The official cause of death was listed as the suspension arm penetrating the skull. One more outlandish theory has been circulating online. The second before contact with the wall the video cuts out. Williams staff found the telemetry box had several data channels cut but never spoke about it. Italian authorities kept the car for 10 years before handing it back to Williams to investigate it. At the exact second Senna stops trying to turn for the corner and his wheel straightens, Senna's head slumps to the left. A brief picture distortion occurs in the moment before the slump, indicating electromagnetic inference from a bullet. Helmet pics that are supposed to show suspension arm penetration looked like a bullet due to its precise size. He was grey, a sign of blood loss, but his only visible damage was a cut above his right eyebrow. Tamburello is not a corner that can be accessed by the public, so a good vantage point. The source of this theory, a forum from 2008, mentioned something about the anniversary of the Illuminati, but any mention of the group basically rendered any theory irrelevant. Also, how are they supposed to hit such a small target travelling at 190 miles an hour? When Bernie Ecclestone sold Formula One to Liberty Media in the winter of 2017, they were going to have to be bold. Ecclestone had held Formula One since 1977 and had grown and commercialised the sport like no one ever had, and Liberty was certainly promising high. They claimed that they wanted to turn Formula One into a sport that listened to its fans and gave them what they wanted, but in the winter of 2018 they did everything but that. Formula One has incredibly only changed its logo 4 times since its inception in 1950. From simple text to the one used in the late 1900s to Carter Wong's design, the one synonymous with Formula One since the 1994 season. The one that no one, to this day, can decide where the one is. But heading into the 2018 season, Liberty Media revealed F1's answer to Marmite, a more simple, sleek design, chosen from 600, that was supposed to embody the core forces of F1 racing, speed, attack and control, and that it looked to the future. Or in the eyes of US-based company 3M, to the Futuro. Futuro is a sub-brand of 3M that produces flight compression tights, whatever that means. The 2 logos are pretty similar to be fair, but I don't think this would be where F1 looks for inspiration. 3M had applied for the trademark to the logo in February 2017 and officially registering it in June, whereas F1 had applied for the logo in November. The argument was eventually settled by an agreement for F1 not to sell therapeutic clothing and sporting equipment, so if your Christmas list included a Dermasilk Hulkenberg shirt or a Logan Sargent tennis racket, you're out of luck. The 2015 Italian Grand Prix went routinely for Lewis Hamilton. That was up until 3:04 p.m. He was cruising to a dominant victory over second-place Sebastian Vettel when he received a message over the radio. Strat Mode 3, we need to pull a gap, don't ask questions, just execute, end quote. But why? The obvious conclusion was that Mercedes had spotted a technical problem or maybe a tyre issue that might require him to make a late pit stop. Eventually he crossed the line to win, 25.042 seconds ahead of Vettel. Tyre pressure is significant because it's so key to car performance and teams don't like to be forced to go higher than they would like. But as a result of the tyre failures in the previous round at Spa, Pirelli imposed a higher pressure minimum with a 25-second penalty if they had failed to do so. As a result of the change, Pirelli decided to do a surprise check later than usual just before the start, and discovered Hamilton's tyre was 0.3 below the limit and Rosberg's was 1.1 below. As it turned out, they both avoided penalties, citing some grey areas in the rules. When Super Aguri took over the British-American racing project in 2005 for the 2006 season and beyond, they stated their claim of wanting a fully Japanese team and they backed that up with their driver lineup. Takuma Sato, who was already at the BAR team as of 2005, stayed on and was partnered by one of the oddest drivers in Formula 1 history. At 31 years old, Yuji Ide was always going to have a tough time of it in Formula 1. Couple that with little to no testing, a language barrier with the engineers, and the engineers themselves pretty much focusing exclusively on Sato's car, and any driver would struggle. But Ide was far from just any Formula 1 driver. His complete lack of experience or success in pretty much anything since the turn of the millennium, save for a couple of strong seasons in Formula Nippon, and no racing at all in Europe since the 2002 season. He finished 7th in French Formula 3 where he raced for Super Aguri's owner's team, which must be where the connection was made. In Bahrain, the pole time set by Michael Schumacher was a 1:31.4. The time to get out of Q1 was a 1:34.7 set by Schumacher's brother Ralph. Takuma Sato, Ide's accomplished teammate, was in 20th with a 1:37.4. Ide was behind him with 1:40.2. The only reason he didn't qualify last was because Kimi Raikkonen suffered a right rear suspension failure. He didn't finish after an engine failure, which saved Super Aguri's blushes after 35 laps. In Malaysia, he was only 1.7 seconds behind his teammate, but retired again after a throttle issue. During qualifying for Australia, he qualified last again, 3.9 seconds behind Sato. On top of that, he blocked the Honda of Rubens Barrichello. He finished 13th, 3 laps down, 1 down on his own teammate, and he spun multiple times during the race and the weekend, which caused team owner Aguri Suzuki to threaten his safety after 3 races. In Imola, Ide caused a first lap crash with Christian Albers that sent the Dutchman into a series of rolls and left him upside down, leading to a warning from the FIA. He retired with a suspension issue on lap 23. Suzuki once again came out with a damning statement saying he didn't have enough testing because he doesn't understand how to use the car. How does one make it to Formula 1 and not understand how a Formula 1 car works? A week after the Imola incident, Super Aguri announced that Ide would be dropped and replaced by Frank Montagny following advice from the FIA that he needed more experience. At 31. The 2008 season was a very tightly contested one between Felipe Massa and Lewis Hamilton, and every possible advantage needed to be grabbed with both hands. Hamilton led Massa by 6 points going into Belgium, and with 6 races left was looking to capitalise on this lead. So when he took pole in Belgium ahead of Massa, he would have seen it as an opportunity to take his championship lead to over a race win ahead of the Brazilian. It was slippery on the Sunday. A drying track saw a lot of action early on as many people who started too safely or not safely enough were penalised. But going down the Kemmel Straight, Hamilton had managed to maintain his lead ahead of this time Kimi Raikkonen, who had overtaken his teammate Massa. On the second lap though, Hamilton span and lost his lead to Raikkonen. By the 10th lap, Kimi had built up a 3-second lead. The order remained this way until after the second set of pit stops onto tyres which suited the McLaren much better. Hamilton attempted to pass Raikkonen at the bus stop chicane but cut across the corner. He led out of the chicane but allowed the Ferrari pass halfway down the straight to avoid the penalty. However, he straight away attacked successfully the Ferrari into turn 1. By this point the rain had restarted and had affected the Williams of Nico Rosberg, who span and rejoined just in front of Hamilton and Raikkonen, pushing Hamilton wide. Raikkonen took the lead, but then lost control of his car and collided with the barrier, ending his race and seemingly, if he could keep it straight, handing the win to Hamilton. 2 hours after the race, the FIA revealed to Hamilton that the penalty for cutting a chicane and gaining an advantage is not just handing the position back, but a drive-through worthy offence. As the race had finished and he had not served a drive-through, the FIA handed Hamilton a 25-second penalty, moving him down to 3rd and promoting championship rival Felipe Massa to 1st place. The Renault Formula 1 team had re-entered Formula 1 in 2000, buying the Benetton F1 team that had bought Michael Schumacher 2 of his titles. They had created a 2-time world champion of their own, Fernando Alonso, who had won in the 2005 and 2006 World Drivers' Championships. After a short stint at McLaren in 2007, he returned to the team for 2008, but it was in a much worse shape. They hadn't won in the season Alonso had left, and were in a much more dire position, with them even said to be near to quitting. 2008 Singapore Grand Prix was the 15th race of the season, which was a tightly contested one. Lewis Hamilton led the World Championship by 1 point ahead of Felipe Massa, and this race would prove to be a crucial one in the title race. It was the first ever night race in Formula 1 history, and it was certainly a spectacle. Massa took pole ahead of Hamilton, but the two Renaults were down in 15th and 16th thanks to a mechanical failure on Alonso's car and just a lack of pace overall from Nelson Piquet Jr., his teammate. During the warm-up lap, Piquet span on the final corner but immediately recovered and took his position on the grid. After 10 laps, Felipe Massa had built up a lead of over 3 seconds to Hamilton, and Kimi Raikkonen was third 7 seconds behind. On lap 12, Alonso became the first driver to come into the pit, switching from the super softs onto the softs, the harder compound tyre, which was a huge gamble as it was incredibly early to pit. 2 laps later, teammate Piquet lost control of his car and hit the wall at turn 17, bringing out the safety car. The two Red Bulls of Mark Webber and David Coulthard, as well as the Honda of Rubens Barrichello, managed to pit before the pit lane closed, which happened in 2007 and 2008 as a result of any big incident. But once it had shut, Nico Rosberg and Robert Kubica had no choice but to pit as they would have run out of fuel before it reopened. Barrichello unfortunately then had a mechanical failure. After all the cars queued up behind the safety car, the pit lane opened and most drivers pitted. Alonso sat in 5th, behind only cars on a one-stop strategy or Rosberg and Kubica, who both received 10-second stop-go penalties for pitting in a closed pit lane. In the pits, Ferrari were refuelling Massa's car when he was given the signal to go with hose still attached. He went the full length of the pit lane before the mechanics caught up and removed the hose. He received a drive-through penalty, after which he came out last. On the restart, Nico Rosberg on softer tyres and lower fuel pulled away from Jarno Trulli and Giancarlo Fisichella on harder tyres and higher fuel. When Rosberg and Kubica served their penalties, they came out 4th and last respectively. Trulli took the lead, but second was taken over by Alonso as Fisichella pitted. Trulli led for 4 more laps before pitting himself, releasing Alonso, who pulled away from Rosberg, who pitted on lap 41, coming out in 7th. Alonso pitted a lap later, coming out still in the lead, and led the rest of the way, taking the victory ahead of Rosberg in 2nd and Lewis Hamilton in 3rd, who would take a killer 7-point lead in the championship. In August of 2009, Renault released Piquet Jr. in favour of test driver Romain Grosjean. Piquet immediately went to Brazilian media with reports of being ordered to crash at the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix. In early September, Renault were found guilty and Renault were given a suspended sentence of 2 years, meaning that they would be banned from Formula 1 if a similar incident happened again. Managing director Flavio Briatore was banned indefinitely from any FIA-sanctioned event, and director of engineering Pat Simons received a 5-year ban. Both the bans were overturned, but were re-overturned on demand from the FIA, who agreed on a ban until the 2013 season. In 2023, Bernie Ecclestone said that both he and FIA President Max Mosley were made aware of what had happened that night, but said they decided to protect the sport and save it from a scandal. There was a rule at the time that a World Championship was untouchable after the awards ceremony, but that isn't stopping Felipe Massa, who is currently investigating. The search for performance in Formula 1 requires a willingness to push the boundaries of the regulations. One example of this is the blown diffuser, which had a huge impact in the 1980s and 90s before falling out of favour. It re-emerged in 2010 at Red Bull, basically controlling the downforce of the cars and acting as a driver aid as well as being used for aerodynamic performance. Over a short span, such as a qualifying lap, it offered a large performance advantage. Working with engine suppliers Renault to extract even more performance out of it, they tried to hide it, but news travels fast in Formula 1 and soon everyone had their own adaptation. For the 2012 season, it and many similar practices were banned. The drag reduction system changed Formula 1 racing. As long as you were in a DRS zone within a second of the car ahead and in dry conditions, you had a significant straight-line speed advantage for the duration of the zone. In 2012, Mercedes had developed a system to gain even more of an advantage out of it. It would lower the front wing as well as the rear, lowering them both once DRS was activated and producing less drag, increasing straight-line speed significantly. It was deemed legal for the 2012 season, but illegal thereon in. In 2010, McLaren developed a system where the drivers could essentially stall the rear wing on the straight, reducing drag and downforce and producing an advantage. But how did it work? In very, very simple terms, airflow was taken inside the car and moved through a series of pipes before being fed out to the rear wing, interrupting irregular airflow and pushing it down, creating the stall. Despite the rules banning driver-induced aerodynamics, the FIA did not prevent the development of the F-duct, and it led to the creation of DRS, a regulated version that everyone had access to. Is this the worst Formula 1 team ever? By the 1991 season, Coloni was struggling. The team consisted of only 6 people and hadn't qualified for a race since the 1989 Portuguese Grand Prix and hadn't finished since the 1988 Portuguese Grand Prix. Therefore, it was not a surprise when the team was sold. The surprise was who it was sold to. Andrea Sassetti is an Italian shoe designer who owned Andrea Moda, a brand of high-end women's shoes. This brand was used as the name of the new team, which was set to enter Formula 1 for the 1992 season, but there were instant red flags. The headquarters of the Andrea Moda Formula team were the former workshops of the Coloni team. The new team continued to use the materials of the old, and according to several observers, there was not much, if any, additional funding. In January 1992, Sassetti set out to recruit employees for his Formula 1 team from his shoe business, because there's a lot of crossover between shoes and Formula 1. A deal was struck between Andrea Moda and chassis manufacturer Simtech for their abandoned 1990 project with BMW, as well as fitting the cars with Judd engines and renaming the entry the Andrea Moda S921. It was not ready for the start of the season, and so instead turned up to the first race of the season with modified versions of Coloni's 1991 car for accomplished driver Alex Caffey and the more unproven Enrico Battaglia. At this point, it didn't look that bad of an operation despite the red flags, but this is where things began to take a turn for the worse. The team was excluded from the race for not having paid their $100,000 deposit for the new teams in the World Championship, as, when buying the Coloni outfit, Sassetti neglected to buy the team's actual entry. Caffey did drive a few laps in the Thursday practice session, but there was nothing else in terms of activity for the weekend. In Mexico, the team once again arrived with all of its equipment, but no cars. They were still being built and neither ran. Following this, both Caffey and Battaglia rightly criticised the team's preparation and got dropped for the sin. They arrived at the Brazilian Grand Prix with the experienced Roberto Moreno and the rookie Perry McCarthy. While Moreno did drive in the pre-qualifying session and his best time was 15.3 seconds off of the second worst time, McCarthy was refused a super licence and did not run at all. He did, however, receive his super licence in time for Spain, but his car only made it a short distance down the pit lane and he lost power. Moreno was once again off the pace, failing to pre-qualify by quite a distance. Around this time, Battaglia, remember him, approached the team again, promising $1 million in sponsorship, and despite Sassetti's attempts, the FIA declined the change, blocking any further driver changes for the rest of the season after their earlier shenanigans. Angry at this, Sassetti began to ignore McCarthy and concentrated on Moreno, and this paid off in Monaco. While McCarthy did not qualify with an official time of 30 minutes and 5 seconds, Moreno found himself in third out of sixth in the session, qualifying for the qualifying session. With 26 drivers out of 30 qualifying for the race, it would be a hard task, but with both the Brabhams struggling towards the end of the team's lifespan and Andrea Chiesa and Paul Belmondo horribly slow, Moreno managed to squeak into the race. There was incredible scenes in the Andrea Moda garage as this had never seemed possible, and the team only looked to be heading downhill, but Moreno had made the best achievement of his career, including winning Formula 3000 and the Macau Grand Prix. The Andrea Moda car lasted 11 laps before the Judd engine blew, but it was an incredible height for the team, and Moreno had even managed to climb to 19th before the issues, but it was downhill from there. The engine that had blown in the last race didn't even appear in Canada as Sassetti had failed to pay Judd. One engine was borrowed from Brabham and given to Moreno, who failed to pre-qualify. Most had left the team by this point and they missed the French Grand Prix entirely thanks to traffic. By now McCarthy's car was essentially being used as a spare from Moreno and he was being treated worse by the day, being sent out on wets in a dry track at Silverstone and only being allowed to leave the pits in Hungary with not enough time for another lap. Andrea Moda was warned by the FIA to run McCarthy as a proper entry or its exclusion would be considered. For the Belgian Grand Prix, both Andrea Moda cars were guaranteed an entry into qualifying as Brabham had withdrawn. They qualified 28th and 29th, 5 and 15 seconds off 27th respectively, and only not last as Eric Comas didn't set a time. In the same weekend, Sassetti was arrested in the paddock for forging invoices. A week later, the World Motorsport Council expelled Andrea Moda Formula for the rest of the 1992 season for failure to operate a team in a manner compatible with the standards of the championship. Any Formula 1 fan worth their salt knows the Bahrain International Circuit. The track first hosted a Formula 1 race back in 2004 and it has hosted the season opener since 2021. But there was an attempt back in 2011 for the track to open proceedings 10 years before it did. So what happened to the 2011 Bahrain Grand Prix? To discover that, we will have to go back to a month before the race. GP2 Asia Series on reflection had an incredible lineup for its final year before folding. Of the 25 drivers, 8 made F1 and many were unlucky not to do so. There was supposed to be 4 rounds of the season from the 11th of February to the 20th of March, with 2 rounds supposed to be held in Bahrain, with one being bought for the F1 weekend and the other was a month before. There ended up being only 2, neither of which were in Bahrain. The first Bahrain GP2 weekend was scheduled for the 18th of February, the Day of Rage. A national uprising and protest in the name of free speech occurred on the 14th of February. It was supposed to be a peaceful protest, but things soon got out of hand. According to witnesses, riot police turned up to the biggest protest of the day on the island of Citra and immediately began firing tear gas, sound grenades and rubber bullets into the crowd. And the people fought back. Many injuries and casualties took place and all medical staff stationed at the Bahrain International Circuit were redirected to hospitals in Manama, forcing the cancellation of practice and later the race. Despite Formula 1 boss Bernie Ecclestone and Crown Prince Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa's interest in still getting the race on the 13th of March, as well as pre-season testing on the 3rd to the 6th of March, they eventually had to postpone and move testing to Spain. On the 3rd of June, the World Motorsport Council unanimously voted to reinstate the Bahrain Grand Prix and move it to the end of October date already held by the Indian Grand Prix, which would be moved to December. This move was an interesting test of character for various figures in Formula 1, in that Mark Webber expressed concerns over the human rights conditions, but Ross Brawn was just a bit miffed that the season finale would be in December. In response to widespread calls and petitions to boycott the race in October, Bernie Ecclestone decided to move the Indian Grand Prix back to the October slot and instead move Bahrain back to December. On the 8th of June, the FIA decided to actually read the regulations and spotted Article 66, which states that no amendments can be made to the arrangements for the championship after entry is open without the agreement of all competitors. A day later, the organisers officially abandoned their bid to appear in 2011. 2006. Alonso versus Schumacher. Old generation versus new. And new had a 15-point advantage heading into the Monaco Grand Prix, and Schumacher was scared. He had pace around Monaco but thought he needed something extra, and his feeble attempt at this something extra came towards the end of qualifying. At Rascasse, Schumacher locked up and slid straight for the walls, instantly calling out the yellow flags and ending Alonso's chances of taking pole, but it was instantly suspicious. Someone of Schumacher's talent and experience doesn't make mistakes, especially not mistakes like that, at such a beneficial time for him, and given his past, it wasn't a surprise when he was sent to the back of the grid. He fought back to finish 5th, but the damage was done, and he ended up losing the World Championship. Mercedes in 2013 were on the verge of something great. Ever since buying the title-winning Braun GP team back in 2010, they had been steadily rising up the grid with Nico Rosberg and Michael Schumacher at the helm, but the 7-time champ had stepped aside to make space for Lewis Hamilton to join the German outfit for 2013, the final year before the hybrid era, and the initial signs were promising. 4 poles in the first 5 races were only marred by a failure to convert as a result of poor tyre wear in the races. The step they took to try and fix this problem was seen as illegitimate by some rivals. After the Spanish Grand Prix, in which the Mercedes drivers took a 1-2 in qualifying but a 6th and a 12th in the race, they were quote-unquote requested by Pirelli to help investigate some issues the tyres had in the regulations, but a bit immoral. This was also compounded by the fact that they did 1,000 miles of testing, about 4 or 5 race lengths, across the span of 3 days. At the next Grand Prix in Monaco, Mercedes performed a front row lockout and Nico Rosberg won. The Monaco Grand Prix is the jewel of the Formula 1 calendar. A home race for many drivers nowadays, it serves as a spectacle and is a formality when it comes to choosing the calendar. As a result of it being such a special occasion, it tends to be where most teams do their most bold advertising campaigns. Think Red Bull's Star Wars livery or McLaren Golf in 2021. But this is the story of the boldest advertising campaign in Formula 1 history. In 2004, the creators of the successful film Ocean's 11 were looking to advertise their new sequel, Ocean's 12, and where better to do it than Monaco? They had the product, the film, and they had their team, the Jaguar R5, driven by Christian Klein and Mark Webber. But how were they going to stand out? Their genius idea became clear very soon. The basic concept was to put a real diamond valued at €430,000 on the front wing of the cars throughout the weekend, but a couple of problems arose. One was that the Monaco Grand Prix circuit is the tightest on the calendar and the most prone to crashes. A front wing is the most brittle and easily broken part of a Formula 1 car, and these are easily lost in collisions. Collisions like lap 1 in the Grand Prix, where Christian Klein lost the car into the Lowe's hairpin and binned it into the wall. Jaguar team officials were not allowed on the track until 2 hours after the race, around 3 or 4 hours after the crash, at which point the diamond was nowhere to be seen and it hasn't resurfaced, becoming one of Formula 1's biggest unsolved mysteries. Ferrari's dominance at the turn of the new millennium was down to a few huge factors. 1, they had the best leadership team on the grid. 2, they had the best driver on the grid, and 3, they had a tyre supplier responding to mainly them. Bridgestone was winning the tyre war between themselves and Michelin all the way up to 2003, where the tide started to shift. Ferrari and McLaren, who were Michelin runners, were locked in an intense title battle, and with Williams, also Michelin runners, bearing down on them heading into the final few races of the season, Bridgestone found a problem with Michelin's tyres and decided to intervene. Article 77C of the sporting regulations stated that the tread width of the front tyres must not exceed 270mm. However, Michelin sporting director Pierre Dupasquier made the point to the FIA that it would be very hard to measure tread width on worn tyres due to the inconsistencies, and the FIA had no response. Bridgestone had processed images of the Toyota cars from Parc Fermé at the Hungarian Grand Prix and discovered that they had a tread width of over 270mm, and instantly went to the FIA with their evidence. The FIA measured the tyre treads of all of the Michelin runners and discovered that whilst Bridgestone's evidence against Toyota was in fact, allegedly, incorrect, one of the Williams cars had tyre treads measuring 276mm. The action that the FIA eventually took came down to 2 options: disqualify the Michelin runners from the race and the podium becomes Michael Schumacher, Nick Heidfeld of Sauber and Jenson Button of BAR, or just warn Michelin. But because of the lack of evidence for most of the teams and despite Ferrari's involvement, the Frenchman got a slap on the wrist. This may have been as a result of Michelin's threats to investigate Bridgestone, but who's to say? This is the story of a time a Nigerian prince scammed an F1 team into oblivion. Nigerian prince scams are very common across the world. They usually take the form of emails to an unfortunate and technologically illiterate OAP, but this time it was Tom Walkinshaw, team principal of the cash-strapped Arrows Formula 1 team, who in 1999 found a message in his inbox. It was from Prince Malik Ado Ibrahim, with a legitimate standing offer in partnership with Morgan Grenfell to take 70% of the team, 45 for Grenfell, 25 for Prince Malik. Walkinshaw duly accepted. For the 1999 season, the Arrows team would run 2 rookies, Pedro De La Rosa and Toru Takagi, and a new engine, the Cosworth. A new engine, a new owner, and new drivers was a refreshing feeling for the stagnant team. So too was the livery. De La Rosa picked up a point in his first race in Australia, but the big talking point was the T- countdown on the side of the car. A countdown to what, exactly? At the San Marino Grand Prix, all was revealed. A press release announced the launch of a new T- brand that was devised by Prince Malik to help provide Arrows with its own exclusive F1 brand. It would sell a wide range of products from energy drinks to clothing to mountain bikes, or so he said. By September, with the business having drummed up a whole lot of nothing, and the Prince not stumping up the alleged cash he owed for the takeover, he disappeared for good, as did Arrows soon after in 2002. At least, we thought. In June 2022, Prince Malik resurfaced as the presidential-elect for the Young People's Party in Nigeria. Not bad for 62. He was unfortunately, from an outsider's perspective, but certainly not an insider's perspective, not elected, as who knows what sort of a car crash he would have caused there. Jos Verstappen is one of the most beloved people in modern Formula 1. He is the father of Max Verstappen, the now 3-time world champion, But did you know, Jos Verstappen was once a driver himself? Competing on and off between 1994 and 2003, he drove for a host of smaller teams such as Simtek, Stewart and Minardi, with the peak of his career being in his debut season. He was the second driver for the majority, to world champion Michael Schumacher. Heading into the German Grand Prix, Michael had a huge lead in the championship with 66 points, while Verstappen sat with a big fat 0. Over 3 seconds behind in qualifying to his teammate, Schumacher qualified 4th, Verstappen qualified 19th, he would need a miracle to catch up to points, let alone his teammate at any point to the race. But these things can change quickly. Back in 1994, teams would have multiple pit stops, not only for tyres but also for fuel. This meant that most pit stops lasted a lot longer than they do nowadays, so the consequences of one bad decision could be long lasting. It also meant that the consequences of a good decision or a minimal time game could be long lasting. As a result, teams looked for any small advantage they could get. One significant example was in the Benetton car, where the fuel filter used to protect the car's components was removed, meaning they could fuel the car up 12.5% faster, but it also meant it could go wrong much easier. On lap 15, Verstappen came into the box, and as the car was being refueled, the valve began to spurt fuel everywhere and the car and some of the mechanics ignited. Permanent burns were caused for 3 mechanics who were inexplicably asked to, a couple of laps later, prepare for Michael Schumacher's pit stop, although he ended up retiring before this happened. Even more incredibly, this seemed to spark, no pun intended, something in Verstappen, who took 2 third-place finishes in the next 2 races, which ended up being the only podiums in his Formula 1 career. Lola is one of the most iconic chassis builders of all time. They provide a chassis for various different Formula 1 teams as well as Formula 3000 kart and Le Mans from 1958 to 1993. But once relations broke down between themselves and Scuderia Italia at the end of 1993, they spent the next year preparing a car for themselves in 1995. You would think that a company with this much relevant experience should be able to build a decent operation, right? Especially as Eric Broadley, founder and team principal, was still involved. Speaking in December 1994, Broadley announced that they had delayed their entry so they could gather together the budget for a highly competitive one. They set out to find sponsorship, and prior to the 1997 season they finally found a major sponsor willing to pay for the team. Mastercard became the team's title sponsor, giving the team the funding to build their own specialised engine as well as a car built around the engine by engineers who already had a high level of understanding around the regulations and more specifically, the holes in them. But there was an issue. Mastercard didn't want to go racing in 1998 like they planned. They wanted to race in 1997 to compete with the brand new Stewart Grand Prix, and they gave Lola an ultimatum: no 1997 race, no funding. And the announcement came in November 1996, which gave the engineers just half a year to design and build a car, with different regs to the ones they were expecting, with half-baked engines that they scrapped before the season for Ford ones used by the awful 40 team in 1996. But they managed to do it. The cars were scraped together, they were just missing somebody to drive it. Lola's test driver, Alec McNish, would have been a good choice, but instead they plumped for pay driver Riccardo Rosset and 1995 Formula 3000 champion Vincenzo Sospiri. In testing, the engine lasted 8 laps. They sent it back out in a different location, but that too blew. They didn't even have time to put the car in a wind tunnel before the first race of the season in Australia. In Melbourne, the cars were slow in the straights and in the corners. They failed to qualify within the 107% time by a huge 5.3 and 6.4 seconds. By contrast, the 2 Stewarts both qualified, with Rubens Barrichello even up in 11th. Even after this, Broadley had no doubt they would qualify in Brazil, so naturally, Lola didn't even turn up to the Brazilian Grand Prix thanks to Mastercard pulling their funding, and a couple of months later Lola went into administration with debts of over £6 million. 2009 was a great time in Formula 1. Red Bull began their surge to the front, Toyota proved money can't buy everything, and Brawn were flying. The season opening Australian Grand Prix was one such example of this. The Brawns looked at the front row with Seb third, while the McLaren of Lewis Hamilton would be the last starter after a gearbox issue, and would start from 18th after the 2 Toyotas were found to be running illegal rear wings and therefore started from the pit lane. However, things would change in the race. A crazy battle of strategy and longevity ensued, and Hamilton and Trulli found themselves 5th and 6th behind the Brawns of Button and Barrichello, Vettel and Robert Kubica, and the last 2 were fighting. Lap 56 saw contact between Kubica and Vettel, which sent the pole into the wall, and Vettel retired on the next lap, sending out the safety car which the race would end under. The order was Button, Barrichello, Trulli and Hamilton, but it was not finished. After the race, Trulli's 3rd place would put under investigation for overtaking under the safety car, which would have seen a 25-second penalty and him out of the points in 12th. Trulli's explanation was that Hamilton pulled over and let him pass, and Trulli went through under the impression Hamilton had a problem. Hamilton told the stewards that he had received no instruction to let Trulli pass and had not consciously done so. On request of Toyota, though, a reopening of the case happened in early April, and McLaren continued to insist that Hamilton had received no instruction even after an audio recording of such a statement had been played. The stewards decided that Hamilton and McLaren had intentionally misled them and disqualified McLaren, reinstating Trulli's podium and creating Ligate. The Brazilian Grand Prix is usually an exciting race. This is helped by the fan base in Interlagos being one of the most passionate on the entire calendar, maybe just behind the Tifosi and Monza, but due to this passion things can sometimes be taken too far. You see, due to the political structure in the country, it has left some people rich and some more very, very poor. The feel-good stories about the Brazilian footballers coming from the favelas might be nice on the surface, coming from rags to riches, but the fact that they came from rags, in some cases literal rags, doesn't paint a very good picture of Brazil. The constant struggle for money for most has left them desperate, and with Formula 1 one of the most lucrative businesses in the world, and the Brazilian Grand Prix one of Brazil's premier sporting events, there is a spotlight shone for such desperate individuals. This has led to constant problems with crime in and around the circuit involving everyone from spectators to teams. There have been many cases of attempted or actual robberies, such as the one on Jenson Button in 2010, Felipe Massa in 2008 or Mercedes in 2016. The highest profile case of this came in the next year in the 2017 Brazilian Grand Prix, where the world champions Mercedes were leaving the circuit in minibuses after Friday practice. One of the buses containing Mercedes team members was held at gunpoint with shots being fired and one member having a gun held to his head. No casualties were taken, but valuables were, and this is just one of many examples. After a second place finish in the 2002 opening Australian Grand Prix, Williams and Juan Pablo Montoya were excited that they could maybe finally overthrow Ferrari after 3 years of title dominance, and so they headed to the second race of the season in Malaysia on a high. He once again qualified behind the dominant Michael Schumacher and so lined up on the front row with him on the Sunday. Heading through the first corner on the first lap, Montoya was trying to take the lead from Schumacher on the outside. Schumacher had enough space but simply understeered into Montoya and breaking the Ferrari front wing and sending the Williams off track. A rare mistake from the Ferrari, and the world waited with bated breath to see the penalty the German was about to receive. So when the message came through on the system saying Juan Pablo Montoya got a drive-through penalty, everyone was naturally confused for two reasons. One, it was clearly Schumacher's fault. Two, what was a drive-through penalty? It was the first ever given in Formula 1 and it definitely made its introduction with a bang. It would have been a more controversial decision, but Williams came home to record a 1-2 anyway with Montoya second, so the stewards got away with a stinker. Sometimes, things happen in Formula 1 that make you go, what the f*** just happened? This was the case in the 1978 Swedish Grand Prix. Ground effect had been discovered in 1977 and by 1978 Lotus had nailed it. Over at Brabham, meanwhile, designer Gordon Murray had some ideas. He'd developed a revolutionary heat exchanger rather than water and oil radiators in an attempt to save weight. There was only one problem. It needed cooling in order to be effective, and nobody at Brabham had thought of anything, so for the moment the idea was scrapped. Until, at the 1978 Swedish Grand Prix, the BT46B was announced to be driven by Niki Lauda and John Watson. They qualified second and third, 6 and 7 tenths respectively off poleman Mario Andretti, but it has been said that this was intentional. They didn't want to show the true power the car had, they saved that for Sunday. John Watson span off after 19 laps, but Lauda drove on, and on, and on. Riccardo Patrese and Ronnie Peterson finished second and third respectively, a huge minute ahead of the whole rest of the grid, apart from one man. Niki Lauda won the 1978 Swedish Grand Prix a whole 34 seconds ahead of Patrese and Peterson, and a whole lap ahead of everyone else. Talk about dominance. With tensions between FISA, the old FIA, and FOCA, the Formula 1 Constructors Association, rising, the team principal and head of FOCA, Bernie Ecclestone, knew that it was only a matter of time before the car was banned, and FISA came down on him like a ton of bricks. So he made the decision to withdraw the car, making it the only Formula 1 car with an 100% record. Only one Formula 1 driver in history has ever not qualified, not finished, and been disqualified from the same race. This is his story. Penske is a huge name to motorsport fans, especially in the US. With 17 IndyCar titles and 4 NASCAR championships to their name, they're up there with the elite names of racing. But only 41 times did a car created under their stewardship ever attempt Formula 1, and they won only once, the 1976 Austrian Grand Prix. But it was the next season, under ATS management, where it occurred. Back in the day, due to the high number of entries, there used to be a cap on how many cars could qualify. In this particular case, the German Grand Prix in Hockenheim, it was 24, so the 30 cars who entered the weekend set out on Saturday and 6 would be eliminated, although they wouldn't pack their bags just yet in case there was a pull-out. The 6 cars who were out after qualifying were Patrick Nev's March, Emilio De Villotta's McLaren, Hans Hayer's Penske, Emerson Fittipaldi, Arturo Nazario and Teddy Pelletti. Neve and De Villotta had issues on race day, so Hayer was the next in line to start. He was already in the pit lane, hoping somebody would have an issue on the formation lap, but unfortunately no one did. The first issues of the race came lap 1 though, where the starting lights had problems, and then Clay Regazzoni and Alan Jones crashed and retired on the first corner. In amongst the craziness, a Penske came out of the pits. That's right. Hans Hayer, on his Formula 1 debut, snuck into the race and was able to continue all the way up to lap 9, where he suffered a gear linkage problem and was subsequently black flagged. Back in 1982, turbocharged engines had begun to dominate Formula 1 and were leaving the naturally aspirated teams behind. The main turbocharged teams, Ferrari and Renault, had been able to bring their cars down to the 580kg weight minimum easily, while everyone else would be under, so the others brainstormed. The solution brought up by Brabham boss Bernie Ecclestone was water-cooled brakes, which allowed them to shed weight across the course of a race. And with the weights being taken at the start of races, and teams allowed to add cooling liquids post-race, a full water tank would help them pass while also letting them be much nippier throughout the course of the Grand Prix. Following the second race of the season, where water-cooled cars took a 1-2, they were appealed and water cooling was banned, although John Watson in his water-cooled McLaren was deemed to have only finished 4th, so his car was not appealed and he was allowed to take second. Ayrton Senna was right about Benetton. Here's why. The technical regulations for 1994 had changed the sport massively. Amongst other things, electronic aids such as power braking and traction control were banned. Potential breaches were called out as soon as the second race of the season, where the Ferrari driver Nicola Larini had allegedly claimed to use traction control in practice for the Pacific Grand Prix, which piqued the attention of Ayrton Senna. He retired on lap 1 of the Grand Prix, but instead of going to his pit box, he went and stood and watched the cars go by, believing the Benetton cars were using traction control. The viewing session didn't do much to quash his hunch, and he returned to the garage even more suspicious. After the 1994 Grand Prix, the FIA asked the teams to finish in the top 3, Benetton, Ferrari and McLaren, to provide copies of their engine management source code. Ferrari supplied instantly, but the other two held off, costing them $100,000 each for the trouble. Nothing came back from the reads from the McLaren or Ferrari, and nothing was heard about the Benetton. Allegations reignited the French Grand Prix, with, starting from 3rd, Michael Schumacher's Benetton jumped both Williams trucks into turn 1. After this, we heard more about the Benetton systems. There appeared to be a launch control system in the software, which could be triggered by a laptop and was in the system under the codename Option 13. Although the team admitted that it did exist, they argued that since Schumacher had no access to it, it was redundant and was only used in testing. As the FIA had no proof it was used, no action was taken, but after everything we know now about Benetton that season, I wouldn't put it past them. Italy, motorsports and passion are 3 words said in the same sentence. Quite a lot. I don't know about you, but I always look forward to the Italian Grand Prix every year, to see all the Italy and Ferrari flags waved by the Tifosi. It's truly an incredible spectacle, and it's an honest shame that they haven't had a race-winning driver since Giancarlo Fisichella, or a driver in Formula 1 at all since Antonio Giovinazzi. Gone are the days where there would be 6 home entrants for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, just like there was in 1978. While 2 of them were eliminated before the Sunday, Alberto Colombo was last in the pre-qualifiers and G-Max was last in the real qualifying session, there were still 4 in contention on the grid. Vittorio Brambilla in 23rd, Arturo Mazzario in 22nd, Bruno Giacomelli in 20th, and Riccardo Patrese in 12th. The man with the switch for the green lights, Gianni Rastelli, was over-enthusiastic about turning the lights on to get the drivers going. This led to a funneling effect, where those in the middle of the field who were still rolling as they went out got a jump in those at the front, and they were all bunched together. In the middle of this pack, Patrese went to overtake James Hunt's McLaren. Hunt, caught off guard, instinctively veered away from the Italian and into the rear right wheel of Ronnie Peterson, sending him into the barriers at high speed and setting his car on fire. 8 cars were caught in the pile-up as a direct result of this, and 3 of the drivers, Hunt, Regazzoni and Depailler, got the Swede free. Peterson and the aforementioned Brambilla, who got hit on the head by a flying wheel, were rushed off to hospital, and although surviving the resulting 27 fractures, unfortunately, Ronnie Peterson died of an embolism the next day. The Grand Prix Drivers Association, essentially the drivers' union, filed an injunction to ban Patrese, who they believed was at fault, from the next Grand Prix in the US, and it was passed. Have you ever watched Rush? The 2013 film starring Daniel Bruhl and Chris Hemsworth depicts the story of the 1976 season, the fierce battle between playboy James Hunt and the workman Niki Lauda in pursuit of the Drivers' World Championship. It was one of the best seasons in Formula 1 history and has been very deservedly immortalised in an iconic fashion. There's one scene I will always remember. I don't know why I remember it, but I do. Hemsworth, in all his manliness, is ecstatic about winning the Spanish Grand Prix ahead of Lauda in second after a slow start to the season. Lauda notices something's up and goes and talks to his team. Then, we cut to a scene with Hunt in his very different mood. His car, as in real life, is disqualified for being 1.5 centimetres too wide. However, it's not shown in the film, but the decision later overturned and Hunt kept his victory in the 1976 Spanish Grand Prix. This is the story of the time that Formula 1 teams were at war with the FIA. The war was between the 2 major organisations within Formula 1 in the 1970s. FISA, the Fédération Internationale du Sport Automobile, which was led by Jean-Marie Balestre and was the subdivision of the FIA, and FOCA, the Formula 1 Constructors Association, which was led by Brabham team boss Bernie Ecclestone and his legal advisor Max Mosley. They, as well as the other budget teams, felt as though FISA were making the sport biased towards the major manufacturers not affiliated with FOCA, Ferrari, Alfa Romeo and Renault. For example, they felt as though technical infringements were punished based on the offender rather than the offence. The first clashing of heads came in 1980 when drivers' meetings were made mandatory. Or so FISA said. The lawyers of FOCA read the rules and noticed that nowhere did it say that attendance was mandatory, and so the drivers didn't turn up in Belgium or Monaco. FISA tried to punish them with $2,000 fines, and after they were refused, their racing licences came into question. At the 1980 Spanish Grand Prix, 15 drivers had their licences suspended. Obviously, this enraged the teams in FOCA. The drivers had been ripped away from them for no concrete reason, and as a result, they threatened not to race. The race organisers, the Real Automóvil Club de España, panicked and offered to pay the fines if the licences would be reinstated, which was rejected by FISA. Then the actual King of Spain got involved, suggesting the notion that they just bypass the FISA regulations and run the race as a non-championship event, re-establishing the legibility of the drivers and just running with no points on offer. Everybody involved at this point were obviously miffed, and FOCA began to draw up plans for a breakaway series, of which there was actually a race, the 1981 South African Grand Prix. But with no major manufacturer, broadcaster or fan support, the teams and drivers scurried back to Formula 1 and FISA just in time for the first race of the season. This led to the first edition of the Concord Agreement, which dictates the way teams compete and how all financial rewards are shared. Things came to a head just before the 1982 season. FISA had included a clause in their new super licenses saying that they must drive for the team that they were currently contracted to and no others for at least 3 years. This led to a strike led by Niki Lauda and Didier Pironi and was joined by every one of the 30 drivers barring
barring Teo Fabi for some reason. A late compromise was found and the drivers raced that weekend, but they were subsequently fined between $5,000 and $10,000 and handed race bans by FISA. This was a decision that was then overturned by the FIA, the first involvement from the higher-ups, with the following critiques of FISA's handling of the situation just the icing on the cake. One of the advantages of being a manufacturer team is that they were able to develop turbocharged engines from their initial concept that most used to light, reliable and fast machines. The non-manufacturer, FOCA teams, had to find ways around this and teamed up to find one around the weighing procedure involving water-cooled brakes that was illegal in every single form of racing barring Formula 1. At the Brazilian Grand Prix, Nelson Piquet and his Brabham won ahead of Keke Rosberg and his Williams, both using water-cooled brakes, with Alain Prost's Renault with a turbocharged engine and no water-cooled brakes in third. Renault immediately protested and Piquet and Brabham were disqualified. FISA accused FOCA of purposely misinterpreting the rules around water-cooled braking systems, to which FOCA claimed that technically it wasn't illegal, which makes it legal, right? Brabham and Williams appealed the disqualifications, but in the meantime there was another Grand Prix. Ferrari took the opportunity to show what would happen if teams were allowed to exploit similar loopholes. Both Ferraris showed up with two rear wings, as technically this wasn't illegal, which makes it legal, right? The FIA, stepping in, decided to stamp down on this before it got out of hand and disqualified third place Gilles Villeneuve's car. The verdict then came in about the Brazilian Grand Prix. Guilty. Disqualification stands. Interestingly enough, Renault only protested Piquet and Rosberg, so everyone else who was actually using water-cooled braking weren't disqualified. We can't know for sure which cars were actually using the system, but we can assume that every car in the points behind Prost and Pironi's Ferrari were using it. This culminated in a boycott of the 1982 San Marino Grand Prix, which was supposed to be every FOCA-affiliated team, but in actuality, Tyrrell, Asella, ATS and Tollman pulled out and 14 cars took to the grid, with 6 non-FOCA teams and the 4 breakaways. The impact the war and the boycott had was insane. Firstly, that Concord agreement I mentioned earlier, that also tied down the teams to racing in every round, and if they didn't do so, a financial penalty. This led to more commercial opportunities, especially for smaller teams. The sponsors now knew the teams would most likely be going there for every race, and so their courage was more guaranteed. In addition, a version of that Concord agreement is used today. Secondly, Eccleston and Mosley were brought on the FIA payroll and would work their way up to leading roles, changing and growing the sport forever. Thirdly, backing out of the boycott would essentially ruin the 4 teams who decided to race. Tyrrell were the last team to get a turbocharged engine and would never get near to adding to their titles, even getting disqualified from the championship in 1984. Tollman were essentially squeezed out by tyre troubles, and even though they did give a debut and 3 podiums to Ayrton Senna, this remains the extent of their legacy. ATS would go extinct just 2 years later, while Asella crawled, and I mean crawled, all the way to 1990, with a total of 2 points in their remaining 7 years and one of the most hilariously sad seasons to see in 1989. 1985 was a controversial time in South Africa. Apartheid was rife and so they were banned from many sporting events. FIFA had cast them aside, so had the ICC, and there was pressure on Formula 1 and the FIA to do the same. The FIA fought back, saying it had been on the calendar for 22 years during apartheid anyway, and the calendar had been known since October the year prior, so why were people suddenly complaining about it? And with that, the race went ahead. But this wasn't the end. Many top drivers, including Alain Prost, the championship leader, Ayrton Senna and Niki Lauda complained, with Senna in particular stating he would not have raced but he was contractually obliged to. The constructors' title was still up for grabs, and Enzo Ferrari claimed that he and his team would withdraw if title rivals McLaren did, but they didn't, and so they both raced. Some governments even stepped in. Ligier and Renault had pulled out under immense pressure from the French government. The Brazilian government almost pulled out 2 huge drivers in Senna and Nelson Piquet. The Finnish government followed suit with almost putting out Keke Rosberg, with the Swedish government announcing Stefan Johansson wouldn't race, before he duly did. Multiple sponsors also pulled out, most notably Marlboro. There was also more controversy even into the races. The Haas Lola of Alan Jones, which qualified 18th, pulled out heading into Saturday. Yes, the race was on a Saturday. It was claimed this was due to illness, but the rumours were that it was actually immense pressure from title sponsor Beatrice Foods which caused them to withdraw. The craziness and massive controversy was likely the reason they cancelled the race the year after, although they announced it before the 1985 race. A Michael Schumacher broken leg saw the other Ferrari rise to the top in 1999, but was it a legitimate title charge from Odi Irvine? Let's discuss. By the time Schumacher had returned, the Malaysian Grand Prix, it looked like the championship battle would go right down to the wire, and a 1-2 for Ferrari, led by Irvine with his title rival and reigning champion Mika Hakkinen in third, saw the Northern Irishman take the lead in the Drivers' Championship. Upon checking the Ferrari cars for legality, some questionable bodywork was found, and before they even had the chance to savour the victory, Schumacher and Irvine were disqualified. Ferrari weren't about to take this and instantly appealed, even having Hakkinen on their side for the court proceedings, which were ruled in favour of Ferrari. With them changing their barge board for the next race though, it was suspicious, but ultimately didn't matter as Hakkinen won the 1999 Drivers' Championship. Half points have only been given out 6 times in Formula 1 history. This is the horrific story of the first. The weekend of the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix started off with a bang. The members of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, GPDA, were furious that the barriers were not bolted together properly and so many refused to drive in practice. The track staff worked tirelessly to fix the barriers in time for Saturday, with some of the teams sending mechanics to help out.
The drivers were still not convinced, but with race organisers threatening legal action if no race was run, as well as the police threatening to seize the cars, forced the drivers to call off the strike. Reigning world champion Emerson Fittipaldi, still furious, did 3 slow laps in qualifying before packing up and going home. Just to emphasise how slow the laps were, he was 26 seconds off the second slowest car and 40 seconds behind the last competitive runner, Lola Lombardi. Niki Lauda and Clay Regazzoni locked out the front row with James Hunt and Mario Andretti second and Vittorio Brambilla and John Watson the third. At the start, Brambilla and Andretti tangled and the American hit the back of Lauda's car, which then hit Regazzoni. Lauda was out and Regazzoni limped back to the pits with hopes mostly gone. Patrick Depailler also retired due to collision damage on the first lap, and Wilson Fittipaldi and Arturo Mazzaria retired in protest. On lap 4, Jody Schechter's engine blew and dumped a whole load of oil onto the circuit. This was at the detriment of Alan Jones and Mark Donoghue, who promptly crashed and retired 3 laps later. Race leader Hunt hit the oil and retired too. Bob Evans, having fuel issues in lap 7, became the 9th retirement, and after that, things quietened down for about 9 laps before Andretti's suspension failed, and he was quickly followed into the paddock by Roloff Wundering, Tom Price and Ronnie Peterson. 2 laps later, tragedy struck when race leader Rolf Stommelin's rear wing broke, sending him into the barrier, bouncing off it and flying over the other side. 4 people were killed by Stommelin's car, while the German suffered a broken leg, broken wrists and 2 cracked ribs. In trying to avoid Stommelin, Carlos Pache also crashed, leaving the total runners down to 10. The race unbelievably continued for another 4 laps before finally it was called to a halt on lap 29. Jochen Mass came across the line to win, with Jackie X in second and Jean-Pierre Jarier in third. Post-race, Jarier was found to have overtaken under yellow flag conditions and awarded him a 60-second time penalty, which was unbelievably harsh anyway, even before you consider the circumstances. On the bright side, however, Lola Lombardi came home in 6th to record the first ever points, well, half point, scored by a woman in Formula 1. This might be the most blatant cheating Formula 1 has ever seen. Wait till the end to find out why. There are weird qualifying sessions, and then there's the 1959 United States Grand Prix. Back in the day, anyone could enter any Grand Prix they wanted, provided they had enough money to cover the entry fee, but sometimes race organisers will pay certain drivers to participate if they thought it would be good promotion. So when reigning Indy 500 winner Roger Ward received a call from US Grand Prix organiser Alex Ullman offering compensation in order to race, of course he accepted. But there was one problem: he didn't have a car. Ullman didn't have a solution to this, so Ward ended up bringing his midget car. This, somehow, passed the technical scrutineering despite its underpowered engine, outboard handbrake and 2-speed gearbox. Ward remained positive though, telling John Cooper and his drivers that on every turn he would blow the European cars off the road. Despite the attempts from the Cooper cohort to explain that he would be the one that was blown away, Ward was insistent that whilst the European sports cars would be faster down the straights, they wouldn't have a chance in the corners. Of course, he was proven wrong, but he had the guts to continue all the way, qualifying last of course, although embarrassing, only 4.8 seconds off second to last Phil Cade, and retiring after 20 laps with clutch problems. This isn't the story you're here for though. The grid on Sunday was different to the grid on Saturday. This was because of one driver's time not being registered until the morning of the race, which put the Cooper climax of Harry Schell on the front row ahead of the Ferrari of Tony Brooks. The Ferrari team were furious, even continuing to argue as the American national anthem played, but after all, Schell started third. What happened with Schell in his final lap time though was not revealed until after the race. Just between the MG bridge and the S's was a mysterious right turn that led seemingly nowhere. However, Schell discovered that it led out to just before the Webster turn, cutting off 5 corners in a long straight, and ended up taking this route, slicing his best time by 6 seconds. In a strong case of karma though, Schell ended up retiring on lap 5. 2012 was one of the best title battles in Formula 1 history. With 2 races to go in the season, Fernando Alonso went into the inaugural United States Grand Prix at the Circuit of the Americas in Austin 10 points behind the much faster championship leader Red Bull of Sebastian Vettel. The Red Bull cars were extremely fast in qualifying, with them taking a 1-3 and a 1-2 in the first 2 sections of qualifying, while the Ferraris of Alonso and Felipe Massa were 9th and 7th respectively in Q1 and 9th again for Alonso in Q2, while Massa was 3rd. In Austin, the dirty side of the grid offers a bigger disadvantage in that the track is slippery as well as dirty, so it was important not to qualify there if you needed a good start. In Q3, Vettel took pole, his teammate Mark Webber took 3rd, Massa took 7th and Alonso took 9th, all on the clean side of the grid, until Romain Grosjean, who qualified in 4th, took a 5-place grid penalty for a gearbox change, promoting Massa to 6th and Alonso to 8th, the wrong side of the grid. With Alonso being the only one in with a shot for the title, Ferrari decided to break the seal on Massa's gearbox, instigating a 5-place grid penalty for him, which promoted Alonso to 7th and back on the right side of the grid. This ultimately worked as Alonso was able to come up to finish on the podium, with Massa coming 4th, although the win was taken by Lewis Hamilton, who started on the wrong side of the grid, with his teammate Jenson Button, who was alongside Massa on the 6th row of the grid in 12th, coming up to 5th. Italy loves Ferrari. Of course, they're a historic brand in not only Italian history but world history, and most know the name. So when an opportunity arises to benefit Ferrari in a competitive sense, you best know the Tifosi will do anything in their power to make it happen. This was the case in the 1960 Italian Grand Prix.
By this time, the 1960 title had already gone to Jack Brabham, and with Ferrari winless, the opportunity arose for the Italian race organisers to manipulate the track to maximise the front-engined, outdated machinery by this time, Ferrari Dino 246's biggest strength, straight line speed. They combined the road circuit and the banked oval circuit, making the fast circuit even faster. This led to safety concerns, as obviously pushing a car over banking could be dangerous, as was discovered by Jean Barra just a year prior. As a result, three of the top teams, Cooper, Lotus and BRM, boycotted the event, leading to a hilariously unbalanced grid, and one that had a total of 0 Grand Prix winners. Phil Hill, Richie Ginter and William Moresi, all Ferraris, took the front row, with Giulio Cabianca the closest driver behind them, 5.4 seconds off Moresi's time. The domination continued into the Sunday when Hill took his first win ahead of Ginter and Moresi in third, with Cabianca in fourth, 2 laps down. Italy loves Ferrari. Of course, they're a historic brand in not only Italian history but world history, and most know the name. So when an opportunity arises to benefit Ferrari in a competitive sense, you best know the Tifosi will do anything in their power to make it happen. This was the case in the 1960 Italian Grand Prix. By this time, the 1960 title had already gone to Jack Brabham, and with Ferrari winless, the opportunity arose for the Italian race organisers to manipulate the track to maximise the front-engined, outdated machinery by this time, Ferrari Dino 246's biggest strength, straight line speed. They combined the road circuit and the banked oval circuit, making the fast circuit even faster. This led to safety concerns, as obviously pushing a car over banking could be dangerous, as was discovered by Jean Barra just a year prior. As a result, three of the top teams, Cooper, Lotus and BRM, boycotted the event, leading to a hilariously unbalanced grid, and one that had a total of 0 Grand Prix winners. Phil Hill, Richie Ginter and William Moresi, all Ferraris, took the front row, with Giulio Cabianca the closest driver behind them, 5.4 seconds off Moresi's time. The domination continued into the Sunday when Hill took his first win ahead of Ginter and Moresi in third, with Cabianca in fourth, 2 laps down. The 1973 Belgian Grand Prix was one of the first major protests from a group of drivers about the safety of a track. A week before the actual Grand Prix, a few drivers went to inspect the track, including Jackie Stewart, Emerson Fittipaldi and Francois Sever. They found that the track had started to break as the result of a previous race, and insisted that unless the circuit was resurfaced to a good enough standard, they would refuse to race. They got to the Friday, and during practice, the surface yet again threw up tarmac, and the Grand Prix Drivers Association threatened to cancel the race. However, overnight repairs cured the issue, and this will be the first of many safety improvements enforced by Sir Jackie Stewart. Was this the scariest crash in Formula One history? Long before the days of Max Verstappen, before the days of Sebastian Vettel, even before the days of David Coulthard, Red Bull with Jaguar, a big name for a small team trying to make an impression in the world of Formula One. Back in those days, you could do in-season testing whenever, wherever and with whoever you liked, as was the case in this. Jaguar were testing some new parts for their 2003 Challenger at Monza, with British Formula 3 driver James Courtney at the wheel when he suffered a rear suspension failure that threw him into the barrier at the Ascari chicane. Both the front and rear wing, as well as all 4 wheels, were removed from the car in the 67G crash. He would have most likely been travelling at around 200 miles an hour before the failure, and it caused him to be unable to walk properly for at least a year after, as well as being unable to see for weeks. He fell unconscious immediately, and when he awoke, who else but Michael Schumacher, who was also testing that day, was screaming at him, trying to translate the words of the Italian marshals. However, he unbelievably only missed 1 round of the British Formula 3 Championship, winning on his return at Alton Park, but this pretty much marked the end of his single-seater career, as in 2004 he made the switch to Super GT, and he has had a high level of success in the Supercars Championship, where he continues to race today. I'll be honest, I can't find much about this one. I can find one Swedish article on Wikipedia which says, among other things, the stable was used by Lotus to compete with the car in the Italian Grand Prix in 1971 and 1972, when Lotus was in conflict with the Italian authorities after Jochen Rindt died during qualifying for the Italian Grand Prix in 1970. Doesn't explain why Alex Solaroy used it in 1917, nor why Emerson Fittipaldi raced with it, and why the only reference article for it won't load. If anyone has any information about it, please tell me and I'll make a part 2. Ferrari had the race organisers completely on their side. Again? Last time I talked about the 1960 Italian Grand Prix, where the race organisers favoured Ferrari and therefore changed the entire track layout with the objective of getting them essentially a free win. But this time out, the 1976 Italian Grand Prix, it was more serious. At the time, the FIA had a regulation about the chemistry of the fuel inside Formula One cars, in that it had to be a mixture of chemicals. One of these chemicals was octane, which was only allowed at the level of 101. The Grand Prix was a sensational return of Niki Lauda from horrific injury sustained in Germany, and he was just 2 points ahead of James Hunt's McLaren. When the octane levels of the cars were tested, 3 cars were seen to be above the levels required legally. John Watson's Penske with 105.7 and the 2 McLarens with a harsh 101.6. A removal of lap times followed, and Hunt and teammate Jochen Mass as well as Watson took up the last 3 slots on the grid. Is this the most disastrous Ferrari driver in Formula One history? This is the story of Jean Barra's 7 races for them. Jean Barra was a huge character in the world of racing back in the 1950s, from secretly replacing Maurice Trintignant in the 1950 Italian Grand Prix to having an ear torn off from a collision in 1955. The man was a hard and passionate racer, so when Ferrari signed him for 1959, you just knew things would go south. He would compete in 2 championships, the World Sports Car Championship and the Formula One World Championship. He would race for Ferrari for the first time at the 12 Hours of Sebring, where he and Cliff Allison would come second in a 1-2. His Formula One account would be opened with a retirement at the Monaco Grand Prix in a race which would already cause problems with Enzo himself. You see, while Berra was racing for Ferrari, he was setting up his own Formula 1 team which made his debut in the same race. Maria Teresa de Filippis would not qualify, but this would irk the higher up. 2 weeks later, and he would retire from the Targa Florio before his first points finish in Formula 1 with 5th in the Netherlands. Another podium just a week later at the Nürburgring. This would be where his downfall started. The next race in the 1959 World Sports Car Championship would be the one they were all in it to win, the 27th running of the 24-hour Le Mans. None of the 4 entered Ferraris would finish the race, with Berra's retiring with engine problems after 10 hours. Berra was accused of straining his engine, worsening his relationship with the team further, but it would all come to a head at the weekend of the 1959 French Grand Prix. Firstly, he once again entered his team into the Formula 2 race, which was supporting that weekend. His driver Hans Hermann would come second, beating all of the Ferraris entered. This enraged Enzo and inevitably raised tensions even higher heading into the Formula 1 race. Berra would qualify 5th, but once again he would have engine problems. After the race, a meeting with the team manager Romolo Tavoni at a nearby restaurant, he was once again accused of straining the engine. Berra reached his breaking point and punched Tavoni as well as another Ferrari team member. He was instantly dismissed from the Formula 1 team, but kept on as a Ferrari factory driver, which wouldn't last long as he made the decision to race a Porsche at Avis in the lead up to the German Grand Prix, and Enzo would let him go. Berra would pass away in this race, but Enzo would refuse to pay his respects as a result. Is this the worst crash in Formula 1 history? The Monaco Grand Prix was the second race of the 1962 Formula 1 season. Graham Hill went into the race the championship leader ahead of Trevor Taylor's Lotus with the Ferrari of Phil Hill in third. It would be none of these on pole, however, as Jim Clark would lead the way ahead of Graham Hill, with Bruce McLaren in third and Willie Moresse's Ferrari in fourth. On the Sunday, Moresse would get a great start and lead into the first corner, but would brake too late and skid. The concertina effect of the cars behind trying to avoid him would lead to a massive incident which eliminated Dan Gurney, Richie Ginther and the Lotuses of Maurice Trintignant, Inza Ireland and Trevor Taylor. When they all came together, a wheel, that of Ginther, would fly off and hit Marshall and Baldoni, taking his life. For some reason they continued with the green flag racing and McLaren would win ahead of Phil Hill and Lorenzo Bandini. Formula 1 drivers nowadays all have brands, but I'm sure you'll never see an advert for them quite like this. You may only know Clay Regazzoni as Niki Lauda's miserable teammate from Rush, but he was also a very competent Formula 1 driver, as 5 wins and 28 podiums would go to show, as well as a competent businessman as he owned and was the face of Clay Regazzoni jeans and jackets, hence where this photo came from. No one tell Quadrant about this, or their next shoot with Lando will be a little different. Is this the harshest time penalty ever? The 1963 French Grand Prix was the 4th race of the Formula 1 season, and Jim Clark, in the middle of one of the most dominant seasons in Formula 1 history, led the championship. He demonstrated his dominance by taking pole position by 7/10 over Graham Hill in second, but it was Hill who would have all the attention on him at the start of the race. His engine would die on the grid and he would get a push start, earning himself a penalty. But was this a disqualification like in Japan 1989 with Ayrton Senna? Or would he get away with an easy penalty like many did at the time? The answer was neither. He got a minute's worth of penalty for his trouble, but this wouldn't change his position. Unhappy with this, the race organisers decided to strip him of his points, which is such a random punishment. Like, they didn't pass them down to 4th place Jack Brabham, they just straight up took them.